in the second year after the long wars, in the autumn of a year that the histories of the kingdom remember only for poor harvest and the death of a minor king's third son. A young woman named Cecily of the house of Marwen rode north on the long road from the southern country, in a small careful carriage drawn by 2 grey horses, with her old servant Ailsa beside her on the bench, and with all the things she still owned in the world packed into 3 small wooden chests behind them. She was 22 years old. She had been a widow for 8 months. Her husband had been a man named Sir Olmeric of the North March, who had been 43 years old when she had married him, and 46 when he had died, of a fever that had taken him in 11 days from a man who walked in his garden with a cane to a man who could not lift his head from the pillow. He had been kind to her, in the careful, distant way of an older man who had married a young woman because his estate required an heir, and his sister had arranged the match. He had not had time to give her an heir. The 11 days had taken him before she had been able to do that one thing for him. She had sat by his bed for the last 4 of those days, holding his hand, and on the morning he had died he had opened his eyes and looked at her, and had said, in a voice that was already very small, "I am sorry, Cecily, I had hoped to give you a better life than this." And she had said, holding his hand, "You did, Olmeric." And he had nodded slowly, and had closed his eyes, and had died perhaps an hour later, in the slow, careful way kind men sometimes die. The terms of Olmeric's will had been clear. The southern estate, where Cecily and Olmeric had lived during the 3 years of their marriage, was to go to Olmeric's nephew, a young man whom Cecily had met twice and who had been, on both occasions, polite without being kind. The northern manor, a small remote holding called Greythorne, on the cold border country where the kingdom's authority became thin and the high moors began, was Cecily's, with one condition. She was required to reside at Greythorne for at least 1 full year before she could sell it, give it away, or return south. The condition had been written into the will. Cecily had understood when the lawyer had read it to her, because Olmeric had loved Greythorne. It had been the place of his boyhood. He had not wanted his young widow to sell it without ever having seen it, in the cold, quick way an unwilling inheritor sells unwanted land. Cecily had not protested. She had not argued. She had thanked the lawyer, and had spent the spring and summer settling the southern estate with Olmeric's nephew, and in the early autumn she had packed her 3 small wooden chests, and she had taken the carriage and the 2 grey horses and old Ailsa, who had been her nurse when she was a child and her companion since her marriage, and she had set out for the north. The road took 12 days. The country grew colder as they travelled. The trees on the second day were still in their full autumn colour, oaks and beeches in red and gold along the southern road. By the 7th day, the trees were mostly bare. By the 10th, the high country had begun, and the first hard frosts had come in the nights, and the breath of the grey horses rose in the cold air at every mile. On the morning of the 12th day, the carriage came down a long slope, and Cecily saw, for the first time, the manor of Greythorne, a small stone house of grey weathered stone, with a single squat tower at one corner and a low courtyard wall around it, set in a shallow valley between 2 high bare hills, with a small stream running past the southern wall and a small wood of dark pine to the east. There was a single thin trail of smoke rising from one of the chimneys. The smoke was thin because there was no one in the house except a steward and his wife, who had been keeping the place for Olmeric for 11 years, and who had been told to expect the new lady in the autumn, and who had lit a small fire that morning to take the worst of the chill out of the front room. The carriage went down the slope. The grey horses crossed the small stone bridge over the stream. The wheels passed under the low arch of the courtyard wall. Cecily stepped down into the cold yard and looked at the small stone manor that was now hers, and she did not, in that moment, have any feeling at all about it. She had been too long on the road. She was tired. The light was failing. The wind from the north was hard. Old Ailsa, climbing down stiffly from the carriage, had said, in her practical way, "Well, the roof appears to be on. That is something." Cecily had laughed, in the small cracked way of a woman who has not laughed in many months. She had said, "Yes, Ailsa, the roof is on." That night she had eaten a bowl of bean soup at the small wooden table in the front room with Ailsa beside her, and she had slept in the small bed in the upstairs chamber that the steward's wife had aired and made up for her, and she had not, when she had first lain down, thought she would sleep, and yet she had slept the long, heavy sleep of exhaustion until well after dawn. She had woken slowly. The fire in the small hearth had been laid fresh. The cold had been kept out of the room. She had lain in the bed for a few minutes, looking up at the dark wooden beams of the ceiling, and she had understood, in the way one understands things on the first morning of a new life, that she was here, and that she would be here for a year, and that the year would be what it would be. She rose, she dressed. She went downstairs. She began. The first 3 weeks at Greythorne went the way the first 3 weeks of a new life often go in the long, careful work of learning what is there. The steward, a quiet man of perhaps 60 named Hal, had shown her every room of the small manor. The front room with its great hearth, the kitchen at the back with its old iron stove, the small dairy off the kitchen, the 4 upstairs chambers, one for her, one for Ailsa, 2 empty, the attic with its single small window, the cellar with its earth floor, and its 3 small barrels of cider that Hal had made the previous autumn from the apples of the small orchard on the southern slope. The steward's wife, Marwen, a stout, careful woman who had been the cook at Greythorne for 20 years, had shown her the kitchen and the pantry, and had explained in slow, patient detail what the manor's small economy was: the few sheep on the high pasture, the half-dozen hens behind the dairy, the old grey mare in the small stable, the small acre of vegetable garden against the southern wall, the wood store under the eaves of the eastern wall, the cellar of preserves that Marwen had been laying down through the autumn for the winter ahead. The manor was small. It was not rich. It was, Marwen had said with a kind of careful pride, enough for a small household to keep itself through a hard winter, if the household was careful and willing to do its own work. Cecily had thanked Marwen. She had thanked Hal. She had walked in those first 3 weeks every part of the small estate, up the slope to the high pasture where the sheep were, down to the stream where the small stone bridge crossed, into the small dark pine wood to the east where the wood for the manor's fires was cut, around the orchard, and along the courtyard wall, and up to the little battlement on the squat corner tower, from which one could see on a clear day, all the way to the high moors to the north, and the small distant village of Frosthelm to the west. She had learned the manor in the slow physical way one learns a place when one is going to live there. She had begun to understand, in those 3 weeks, why Almeric had loved it. The manor was small and quiet, and it was held in the hands of the great cold high country, in the way a cup is held in the hands of a careful man. And there was, in the cold and the quiet, and the small careful economy of the place, something that she had not known she had been missing until she had begun to live in it. She had been, in those 3 weeks, alone with her thoughts more than she had been alone with them at any other time in her young life. She had thought about Almeric. She had thought about the 3 years of her marriage, which she had not, while it had been happening, examined too closely. She had thought, sitting in the front room in the evenings with a small fire burning and Ailsa knitting beside her, about the shape of her own life as it now was, a young woman, widowed, with a small remote estate she had been required to inherit, and that she did not, when the year was up, fully know whether she would sell. She had thought about the south, where her own family was, and where she could have gone if Almeric had not written the year condition into his will. And she had understood, slowly, in those 3 weeks, that she did not actually want to go south. The south had been her childhood. The south had been her marriage. She did not, anymore, fit there. She did not yet know what she fitted into. But she knew, before the 3rd week was out, that the south was not what came next. Then, on a cold afternoon in the 4th week, the night came. It was a grey afternoon, with the first heavy snow of the season just beginning to fall, the small, slow, wet snow that comes early in the high country, before the deep cold sets in. Cecily had been in the front room, mending a torn corner of a curtain. Ailsa had been in the kitchen with Marwen, helping with the evening's bread. Hal had been out at the wood store, splitting the last of the autumn's wood. The horses had all been in the stable. The hens had been in the small henhouse. The yard had been quiet. Cecily had heard, through the thick stone walls, the slow, heavy approach of a horse on the cold ground. She had set down her mending. She had risen. She had gone to the small window beside the front door and had looked out into the yard. A large, dark horse, exhausted and limping, was walking slowly into the courtyard through the open arch. A man was on its back. He was a big man, broad shoulders, a long dark cloak over what appeared beneath the cloak to be a long mail hauberk, a large iron-bound saddle, a sword at his hip. He was bareheaded. His helm was tied to the back of the saddle. His hair was dark and long and matted. He was leaning forward over the horse's neck, with one hand braced on the saddle pommel and the other arm hanging at his side in a way that had something wrong about it. He was, Cecily understood as she watched him, very near to falling out of the saddle. The horse stopped in the center of the courtyard. The man, with what looked like the last of his strength, raised his head and looked at the front door of the manor. He did not call out. He did not knock. He simply sat on the horse, swaying slightly, and looked at the door. Cecily had opened the door before she had made any conscious decision to open it. She had stepped out into the cold yard. The snow had been falling on her shoulders, on the man, on the horse. The man had looked at her with the careful, tired courtesy of a soldier who has been on the road for a long time and has not, in some days, been spoken to by a woman. He had said, in a voice that was hoarse but clear, "Madam, forgive the intrusion. I am Sir Roderick of the North March. I am riding home to a holding 3 days further north of here. The winter has caught me sooner than I planned. I have a wound that has not been treating itself well. I could ride no further today, and I cannot, I think, ride at all in the snow that is coming. I would beg of you the courtesy of a stable for my horse and a corner of any outbuilding for myself, until the weather permits me to go on. I can pay. I can also, if it would be useful, work for what I am given." He had said this in a single careful breath, like a man who had rehearsed it on the road and who knew he might not have a second breath in which to say it again. Then he had been silent. He had not dismounted. He had been waiting, Cecily understood, for her answer before he tried. She had said, and her voice had been steadier than she had expected it to be, "Sir Roderick, you can come down. The stable is at the back of the courtyard. We will see to your horse and to your wound. There is no need to speak of payment now." He had looked at her for a moment longer. Then he had nodded once and had begun to dismount, and the dismount had not gone well. He had got his right leg over the saddle and had then, halfway down, simply slid the rest of the way to the ground, and had landed in a half-crouch on the cold stones of the yard, and had stayed there for a moment, breathing hard, with his good hand braced on the stone. Cecily had been beside him before she had thought about it. She had not, in her young life, helped a wounded soldier off a horse. She had not, in her young life, knelt on cold stones beside a man whose breath came in the careful, pained way of a man whose ribs were probably also bad. She did not, in that moment, know what she was doing. She only knew she was doing it. He had let her help him to his feet. He was very tall, even bent over with his arm against his side. He was taller than she was by a head, and he was heavy with armor, and she could not have, in any practical sense, held him up if he had fallen. But he had not fallen. He had got himself upright by grip and will. He had nodded to her very slightly and had said, "Thank you, lady." Hal had come from the wood store at that moment, drawn by the sound of the horse. Hal had taken one look at Sir Roderick and had said in his slow, practical way, "I'll see to the horse, my lady. You take the gentleman inside." The horse had been led to the stable. Sir Roderick had been helped, slowly, across the yard and up the 2 stone steps and through the front door and into the warmth of the front room. Cecily had got him to the great chair by the hearth before he sat down. He had sat down very heavily, like a man whose legs had been keeping him upright by argument rather than by strength. He had closed his eyes for a moment. He had opened them again and had looked at her with something that was almost a small grim humor. He had said, "I had not been entirely sure I would reach the door." She had said, "I had not been entirely sure either." He had laughed, a small short laugh that had ended in a cough. The cough had hurt him. She had seen it in his face. Ailsa had come from the kitchen at the sound of the cough. Ailsa had been a woman of 56 years, and had nursed Cecily through a fever in childhood and Ulmeric through the 11 days of his last illness, and had a quick eye for what hurt a man and what did not. She had taken one look at Sir Roderick and had said, "My lady, we will need hot water and the cleanest linen we have, and the small part of comfrey I brought in my bag, and a knife with a blade that has been in the fire." Cecily had said, "Yes, Ailsa." Ailsa had said, "Sir Roderick, will you let me look at the wound?" He had looked at Ailsa and had recognized in her the careful, steady authority of an older nurse who had seen many wounds, and he had said, "Yes, madam, "Forgive me, I have not had it tended for 9 days. It has been too cold to undress on the road." Ailsa had said, "We will have it tended now." The wound had been a sword cut across the top of the left shoulder, going down toward the collarbone, an old wound by now, of perhaps 2 weeks, that had partially closed and partially not, and that had become inflamed and slightly fevered along its length in the way wounds do when they have not been properly cleaned. It was not, Ailsa had said, after she had looked at it carefully in the warm light of the hearth, a wound that would kill him. It was a wound that, if it had been left another 2 weeks without tending, could have become a wound that killed him. As it was, it would heal slowly over the winter, and would leave him with a stiff shoulder for the rest of his life, and would never again allow him to lift a heavy sword above his head. But it would not, in any final sense, kill him. He had nodded gravely at this prognosis. He had said, "I had thought as much, madam. I am grateful for the confirmation." Ailsa had cleaned the wound. It had been a bad business. He had had to bite down on a folded leather strap that Hal had brought from the stable, and Cecily had had to hold the lamp very steady. And at one point, he had made a small low sound that he had clearly been trying not to make. And Cecily had looked at his face for the briefest moment and had seen, under the dirt of the road, the dark beard, the lined eyes, the face of a man who had been on the road too long, alone, wounded, and who had got himself, by sheer continuation, to a door where someone had let him in. She had looked away again quickly. She had held the lamp steady. The wound had been cleaned. Comfrey had been applied. Clean linen had been bound around his shoulder. He had been given hot soup and a cup of strong wine, and Hal had brought down clean blankets from the upstairs chest, and a small bed had been made up for him in the empty chamber on the ground floor that had once been Ulmeric's father's library. He had slept for 2 days. When he woke, on the 3rd morning, he was clearer in the eyes and stronger in the voice. He sat up in bed and asked, in his careful way, whether he might be permitted to wash, and to put on clean clothes if any could be found that would fit him. Hal had a son, who lived in the village of Frosthelm, and who was a large man, and Hal had been to Frosthelm the previous afternoon, and had brought back a clean linen shirt, and a pair of dark woolen trousers, and a heavy wool tunic, all of them slightly too small for Sir Roderick, but closer to fitting than anything else they had. He had washed in a wooden basin in the small chamber. He had dressed slowly, in the slow, careful way a man with a half-healed shoulder dresses. He had come out into the front room, walking slowly, and had stood beside the great chair by the hearth. He had said, "My lady, I have, I think, troubled your house enough. I am well enough to ride on tomorrow if the weather permits." Cecily, who had been at the wooden table with Ailsa working on the household accounts, had looked at him. She had said, "Sir Roderick, the weather will not permit it tomorrow. Hal has been to the village this morning, and he says the deep snow has begun in the high country to the north, and that the road from here to the moors is closed and will be closed for the winter. You cannot ride home to your holding tomorrow or next week or next month. You will not ride home to your holding until the spring." He had been silent for a moment. He had said, "I see." She had said, "We have an empty chamber. We have plenty of food laid down for the winter. You offered when you came to work for what you were given. I will accept that offer. The household will need a man for the winter. Hal cannot do everything alone, and he is not as young as he was. You will stay here through the winter, and you will work the household needs, and in the spring, when the road opens, you will ride home. That is my proposal. You may accept or refuse." He had looked at her for a long moment. She had not, in the speaking, looked at him directly. She had been arranging the household accounts on the table in front of her in the small, careful way one arranges things when one has just said something one is not entirely certain one should have said. But when he had been silent for long enough, she had looked up at him. He had been looking at her with an expression she had not been able at the time to read. He had said slowly, "Lady Cecily, I accept the proposal. Thank you." That was the beginning of the winter at Greythorne. He moved into the small chamber that had been Ulmeric's father's library. He took his meals at the wooden table with the household. He worked. In the first weeks, while his shoulder still hurt him too much for hard work, he did the small, careful work of a man who could only use one arm, feeding the hens, helping Marwen carry the heavy cooking parts, sitting at the wooden table in the front room, mending small leather things that Hal had not had time to mend. By the end of the second week, his shoulder was strong enough for him to begin the slow work of splitting wood, which he did one-handed for some weeks more, leaning the logs against the splitting block and bringing the axe down with his right arm only, slowly, carefully, but in the steady, patient way of a man who had been taught, in his soldiering, never to waste the work that was in front of him. He spoke little in those first weeks. He was a man of small speech by nature, but what he did speak, he spoke carefully, and when Cecily or Ailsa asked him a question about the road he had come down, about his holding in the north, about his shoulder, about the meal, he answered fully, in the steady voice of a man who did not believe in hiding behind silence when a question had been asked in good faith. She learned about him slowly, across the long evenings. His name was Roderick. He was 37 years old. He was the second son of a small noble family of the north. The family had a holding called Stoneridge, 3 days' ride further north of Greythorne in the high country, which had come to him 11 years before when his older brother had died of a hunting accident. He had not been at Stoneridge when his brother had died. He had been, at that time, 3 years into a long campaign in the eastern country, fighting in the wars that had taken so many of the kingdom's young men, and that had ended, in the end, in a peace that had not been satisfactory to any of the kingdoms involved. He had not, when the news of his brother's death had reached him, been able to come home. He had been in the middle of the campaign. He had written to his father a long, careful letter in which he had said that he would come home as soon as the campaign was concluded, and his father had written back that he understood and had begged him only to take care of himself. His father had died the following winter. Roderick had not been able to come home for that either. The campaign had not been concluded. When the wars had finally ended, 2 years later, Roderick had been a man of 33 years, and Stoneridge had been kept by a small careful steward for 3 years without its lord. Roderick had been preparing to ride north then, to take up his inheritance, but he had been recruited instead by the king's own captains for one final campaign against a southern duchy that had taken advantage of the war's end to seize a stretch of contested coast. The campaign had been brief but bad. Roderick had been wounded twice, the second time the wound across the shoulder that had brought him down at Greythorne. The campaign had ended in the late summer. He had been released from service in early autumn. He had spent 2 months recovering in a southern monastery before he had taken to the road, intending to ride home at last to Stoneridge and to take up the holding he had not seen in 11 years. The road had taken longer than he had planned. The wound had not healed cleanly. The autumn had been cold. The winter had come early. He had, in his careful way of telling a story, mentioned no women. Cecily had not asked. Ailsa, in the kitchen on the morning of the second week, had said quietly, while she was kneading bread, that a man like that might have been married in the 11 years he had been gone, and that, given how long he had been gone, the wife, if there had been one, was almost certainly someone he had not seen since long before the war's end. Ailsa had said this in a practical way, neither approving nor disapproving, and had gone on with the bread. Cecily had not said anything to this. She had thought about it for some time afterward, in the slow way she thought about things in those weeks, and she had decided that she would ask, eventually, if it became something she needed to ask. For the present, she did not need to. The deep cold came in the second week of December. It was the kind of cold the South Country did not have, and that Cecily had not, in her young life, experienced. The wind from the high moors blew for 3 days straight, with a hardness that made the windows of the manor rattle in their frames, and the smoke from the chimneys flatten sideways along the courtyard wall. The snow, when it came, was not the wet, slow snow of the autumn, but the dry, hard snow of the deep winter, fine and cold and heavy, falling in a steady, silent way for 2 days, until the courtyard was waist-deep, and the path to the stable had to be cut new each morning. The hens were brought into the small dairy. The sheep had already been brought down to the lower pasture in the late autumn, and were now in the small stone byre against the eastern wall. The water in the well froze in the night, and had to be broken with a wooden mallet each morning before the day's water could be drawn. The wood store, which had been full at the beginning of December, began to empty quickly. In those days of the deep cold, Sir Roderick became, quietly, without anyone having asked him to, the man of the household. He cut wood. He broke the ice in the well. He cleared the path to the stable each morning. He shoveled the courtyard. He hunted, on the days when the snow was firm enough to walk, and brought back, twice in the second week of December, a small deer that fed the household for 10 days. He did all of this in the careful, steady way he did everything, with no sense of haste and no sense of grievance, in the way of a man whose habits of work had been shaped by many years of a campaign and who did not, anymore, have any other way of being in the world. Cecily watched him work in those weeks. She watched him in the way one watches a man when he's beginning to understand. She did not yet know what she was understanding. She knew only that the small, careful presence of him in the household, the slow, steady patience of a tall, scarred man who did not waste words, had become, over the 8 weeks he had been at Greythorne, something the household had organized itself around without anyone having said so. She herself was changing. She had not understood this either at first. She had come north as a young widow, with a year ahead of her that she had thought of as a kind of imprisonment, a year to be served before she could decide what to do next. 8 weeks into the year, she had begun to understand that she was not being imprisoned. She was being changed. The work of the small estate, the cold, the long evenings by the hearth, the careful, steady company of the 4 other people in the house, Hal and Marwen, who were quiet and good, Ailsa, who had been her companion for many years, Roderick, who had become the 5th person in the small, careful economy of the household, had begun to make her into someone slightly different from the woman who had ridden up the slope in the autumn. She did not entirely know yet what that someone was. She knew that she was, day by day, more comfortable with herself in this place than she had been with herself anywhere else in her young life. She and Roderick spoke in those weeks mostly about practical things: the wood, the hens, the state of the path to the stable, the small careful matters of a household keeping itself alive through a hard winter. They spoke also, occasionally, about other things, about books, of which Roderick had read a small careful number in his soldiering years, in the way of a man who had carried a few books in his saddle roll across the campaigns, about the southern country where Cecily had grown up, which Roderick had passed through twice on his march toward the wars, about Almeric, of whom Roderick had known a little, having served under him in his very first campaign as a young squire of 15, 22 years before. Roderick had spoken of Almeric kindly. He had said that Almeric had been a good captain, careful with the lives of his men, and that the young squires under him had liked him. Cecily had been glad of this. She had not, in her marriage, known much of Almeric's young years. The small careful description Roderick had given her of a young captain in his first campaign, 22 years ago, had been a small, unexpected gift. The deep cold broke in the 3rd week of January, into a kind of grey damp thaw that was, in some ways, harder than the cold itself. The snow turning to wet slush in the courtyard, the well water filthy with the runoff, the wood store damp, everything cold and wet at once. Cecily caught the fever in the last week of January. She did not know at first that she had caught it. She had only noticed that she was tired, and that her head hurt, and that the warmth of the great chair by the hearth was suddenly not enough warmth. By the 2nd day she had been in bed. By the 3rd she had been delirious. She had spent 6 days in the small upstairs chamber with Ailsa beside her, and Marwen coming up several times a day with broth and water, and Roderick, on several occasions, when Ailsa had needed to sleep, sitting in the chair beside the bed, in the slow, steady way of a man who had sat beside many sick men in many camps, and who knew how to sit beside a sick person without asking anything of them. She remembered afterwards, in the careful way one remembers feverish things, the small flickering pieces of those 6 days. She remembered Ailsa's hand on her forehead. She remembered the cool cloth that was changed every hour. She remembered Marwen's voice, quiet and careful, saying, "Drink this. Child, drink this slowly, She remembered on the night she had been most ill, the 3rd night, when the fever had been at its highest, opening her eyes for a moment and seeing Roderick sitting in the chair beside the bed, with his face in his hands, and his elbows on his knees, and his shoulders very still in the way of a man who is praying or who is trying not to cry. She had not been able to tell, in her fever, which it was. She had closed her eyes again. She had not, when she had been clearer in the days afterward, asked him about it. She had not been certain, she had not dreamed it. She had recovered slowly, in February, in the way one recovers slowly from a bad fever in a cold winter. The first time she had been well enough to come downstairs, in the second week of February, she had walked very slowly into the front room and had sat in the great chair by the hearth, and had taken a cup of broth from Marwen, and Roderick had been at the wooden table mending a leather harness, and he had looked up when she had come in, and he had stood slowly with his stiff shoulder, and he had bowed to her very slightly, and had said, "Lady, it is good to see you out of bed." She had said, "It is good to be out of bed." He had sat down again. He had gone on with the harness. The household had gone on with its small, careful work. She had drunk her broth. She had watched him at the table. She had thought, in the slow, careful way she had thought about him many times in the past 2 months, that something between them had become, without either of them having said anything of it, something other than the courteous arrangement of guest and hostess. She did not know yet what it was. She knew that he had sat, on the third night of her fever, in the chair beside her bed with his face in his hands. She knew that she had been glad he had been there. The thaw became a real thaw in the first week of March. The wood store, which had become alarmingly low in the deep cold, began to be replenished from the trees Roderick had cut and dragged in during the deep cold. The courtyard became, instead of waist-deep snow, a wet expanse of mud and grass. The hens were let out of the dairy and began to scratch in the wet yard. The grey mare in the stable, who had been kept indoors for most of the winter, was brought out and walked slowly up and down the lane to the village to get the stiffness out of her legs. The sheep on the lower pasture began to look, for the first time in months, like creatures that intended to live until spring. Roderick's shoulder, in those same weeks, became finally steady. He could lift his left arm over his head again, slowly, with effort. He could not do it lightly. He could not, as Ailsa had predicted, do it with anything like the strength he had once had, but he could do it. He could ride, for an hour at a time, without pain. He could swing an axe with both hands for a few strokes before the shoulder began to ache. He had become, in the careful way of a man who had been a soldier all his life, the new shape of himself that he would now live in for the rest of his years. The road to the north opened, in the third week of March, into a passable mud track that Hal said could be ridden in 2 days' careful travel by a man on a horse who knew the country. Cecily had known the road would open. She had known it for weeks. She had known, in some private way she had not allowed herself to think about directly, that the opening of the road was the moment Roderick would tell her he was riding on. She had been steeling herself for this moment, in the small careful way one steels oneself for an inevitable difficulty, and on the morning Hal came back from his ride to Frosthelm and reported that the road was open, she had sat down at the wooden table with her hands folded in her lap and had tried to compose her face for what was coming. Roderick had come into the front room from the courtyard where he had been splitting wood. He had been wiping his hands on a piece of cloth. He had looked at her and at Hal and had understood, in the slow way he understood things, what had been said. He had said, "The road is open, then." Hal had said, "It is, sir. 2 days' travel north to your country in the careful way." Roderick had nodded. He had stood for a moment by the door. Then he had come across the room and had sat down on the wooden bench across from Cecily at the table. He had said, "Lady Cecily, I would like, if I may, to speak with you about a matter." Cecily had said, "Yes." He had been silent for a moment. He had looked at his hands on the table, the large weathered hands with the small old scars across the knuckles, and then he had looked up at her. He had said, "Stonebridge has been kept by a small careful steward for 14 years. The steward is a good man. He has written me letters once a year all those years, and the letters have been honest letters. The estate is as it was when my father died. The fields produce what they produced. The household keeps itself. The steward will, I think, continue to keep it for some time more if I asked him to. He had said, or he will, if I asked him to, become its master in his own right. He has earned that. He has kept it without me for 14 years. I do not, in the strict accounting of the thing, owe Stonebridge my person any more than I owe my own life to the campaigns I served in. I gave that life. I did the work. The campaigns are over. I am, And this is the thing I have been thinking about, lady. Since perhaps the second week of December, I am a man with a place I could go to and a place I could stay. He had been silent for another moment. He had said, "Lady, I have come to ask you a question. I have been preparing myself to ask it for some weeks. The question is whether you would, when the year of your residence here is up, consider the matter of remaining at Greythorne, and the matter of having the company of a man who would, if you would have him, remain here with you. I do not ask for an answer today. I ask only that you consider it. I will, if you would prefer it, ride north tomorrow and take up Stonebridge as I had originally intended, and you may forget I spoke. Or I will, if you would prefer it, ride north next week and write to my steward asking him to remain master of Stonebridge in his own right, and return to Greythorne, and remain here as the man of this household for the rest of my days, in whatever capacity you would choose to define." He had said, "I am 37 years old. I am not anymore the young man I was when I went to the wars. I have a stiff shoulder and a number of small scars and a habit of small speech and a way of working that is steady, but is not the work of a young man. I would not, lady, ask you to take a young man's bargain. I am asking you only, whatever shape you would choose, for the bargain of an older man who has, in the 8 months of being in this house, become the man he was always meant to become, and who would not now fit any other house in the world." He had stopped. He had been looking at her in the careful, steady way, with no expectation in his face at all, only the patient, open attention of a man who had said a thing he had needed to say, and who was prepared now for any answer. Cecily had been silent for a long moment. She had said, "Sir Roderick." He had said, "Lady." Had said, "I do not need a week to consider." He had been silent. She had said, "I would prefer that you write to your steward this evening, and that you send the letter with Hal in the morning, and that you do not ride to Stonebridge at all. I would prefer that you remain at Greythorne. I would prefer, and we will speak with the priest at Frostthelm next week about the small, careful matter of how this is done in the proper manner. I would prefer that you remain here as the master of this house, and as my husband, if you would still have me as your wife after I have said that I have been thinking about this matter for several weeks myself." He had stared at her. He had said, after a long moment, in a voice that was quite different from any voice she had heard him use in the 8 months he had been at Greythorne, "Cecily." She had said, "Yes." He had reached across the table. He had taken her hand. His hand was very large around hers, and warm, and rough in the small particular way of a hand that had spent 15 years in mail gauntlets. He had not said anything else. He had not needed to. They had sat at the wooden table for a long time, with their hands together, and Hal, who had been, very tactfully, finding things to do at the far end of the front room while this conversation had been taking place, had at some point gone out into the courtyard and had quietly closed the door behind him. They were married in the small stone church at Frostthelm on a clear, cool morning in the second week of April, in a small, careful ceremony attended by the priest, by Hal and Marwen, by Ailsa, and by perhaps a dozen of the people of Frostthelm village who had come to see the new lord of Greythorne marry the young widow who had inherited the manor. Roderick wore a clean linen shirt and a heavy grey wool tunic. Cecily wore a simple grey dress that Marwen had altered for her from one she had brought from the south, with a small pale circlet of early spring flowers in her hair that Ailsa had made for her on the morning of the wedding. The priest was an old man, kind and slow, who had married many couples in his long years, and who had a way of saying the words of the ceremony as if he had, on each occasion, only just then thought of them. He pronounced them husband and wife in the slow, careful voice of his profession. They had walked out of the small stone church together into the cool morning of the high country, and the small group of villagers had cheered, and Marwen had cried, and Hal had clapped Roderick on his good shoulder, and Ailsa had kissed Cecily on the forehead in the quiet way that mothers and old nurses kiss the daughters of their hearts on important days. They lived at Greythorne for the rest of their lives. Stonebridge passed, by the letter Roderick had sent with Hal that next morning, to its long faithful steward, who became its master in his own right, and who held it, for the next 31 years, in the same careful, patient way he had held it before. Roderick took up the small, careful work of the master of Greythorne, in the slow, patient way he had taken up every duty in his life. Cecily took up the small, careful work of the Lady of Greythorne. In the slow, patient way, she had taken up the year of her required residence, and had found, in that year, the shape of her own life. They had 3 children, 2 daughters, Aldis and Mara, and a son, Ulmeric, named for the kind older man whose careful will had brought Cecily north in the first place. And the children grew up in the small grey manor in the high country, and ran in the small wood to the east, and learned to ride on the grey mare and the smaller horses that came after her, and grew, in the slow, careful way the children of Greythorne grew, into adults who loved the place where they had been born. Roderick was, in his late years, a man of great quiet. He sat by the hearth in the great chair that had been his on the day he had ridden into the courtyard, and he watched his children play, and he watched his wife at her work, and he did not, in any of the years that followed, regret the choice he had made on the morning Hal had returned from Frosthelm with the news that the road was open. His shoulder was always stiff. He never lifted a sword above his head again. He never had to. Cecily was, in her late years, a woman of great steady warmth, the kind of warmth that is built slowly, across a lifetime, in a small place that has been chosen and kept. She did not, in all of those years, regret the year of required residence either. Ulmeric's careful clause in his will, written by a kind older man who had wanted his young widow to see the place he had loved before she sold it, had given her the only year in which she could have, perhaps, become the woman she was always meant to become. She thought of him often, in the long, quiet years. She thought of him with gratitude. She thought of him in the way a woman thinks of a kind old friend who has done her, without entirely meaning to, the greatest service of her life. The manor of Greythorne stands, in the high country, still small, grey-weathered, with the same single squat tower at one corner, and the same stream running past the southern wall, and the same small wood of dark pine to the east. The descendants of Cecily and Roderick of Greythorne still live there. The grey mare is long gone, and the great chair by the hearth has been replaced, and the orchard has been cut down twice and replanted twice, and the manor is, in many small ways, not the manor it was on the morning the carriage came down the slope in the autumn of a year the histories barely remember, but it is still, in the careful, steady way of small places that have been kept by people who love them, the same manor. The courtyard is still the courtyard a knight rode into in late autumn, exhausted and wounded, asking only for a stable and a corner of an outbuilding. The front door is still the door a young widow opened, on a snowy afternoon, before she had thought about whether to open it. The hearth is still the hearth they sat by, in the long winter evenings, as the slow, careful business of becoming the people they were going to be became, without either of them quite noticing, the love of their lives. Good night.